Hey guys, can you guys hear me okay? I'll have to lean over the mic, I guess. Thank you so much for coming. It really is humbling, and it's an honor to be able to speak to you guys. And I'm just terribly excited about being at a prophecy conference because, I know all kinds of people come to figure out that the Bible is God's Word in different ways. But for me, it was prophecy. And I'll tell you a little bit about that as soon as I get this up. Let's see. Slideshow, here we go, from beginning. Okay, and we'll be talking about the deep state and how we ought to understand it and resist it. And I mentioned that I had figured out that the Bible was true through prophecy. So I actually started learning about all this deep state, New World Order stuff years before I became a Christian. In fact, I was an atheist when I started studying this stuff. And I saw, oh my goodness, these people are insane and they're trying to build a world government. That's odd. And studying more, you start to see that they behave in ways that are not normal. You can't really explain them from a secular perspective. What are they doing in the woods with a giant 40-foot stone owl? I'll show you the video in a moment. What in the world? How does a secular person or an atheist explain such things? And as I realized that we were moving toward this world government, it just kind of hit me one day. Well, the Bible predicted all this 2,000 years ago. And, when he wrote these things, let's take a look here at Revelations chapter 13. He causeth all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark in their right hand or in their foreheads, that no man might buy or sell save he that had the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name. And 2,000 years ago, that must have sounded so preposterous, right? You didn't even know where the end of the world was. You didn't know that there was tribes in the Amazon and in Africa, and the people who were in this area of the world had never even talked to. The idea that a global government could create a system where you couldn't buy or sell without its permission, that must have sounded completely ridiculous, right? Imagine yourself 2,000, even today it sounds ridiculous to some people, but now we can see it all coming into view. And so I'm going to show you here just a couple of clips, because these people talk about their agenda pretty openly.
Because of addiction to drugs.
We have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order, a world where the rule of law,
right or wrong,
not the law of the jungle, governs the conduct of nations.
So here's what worries me.
I've got many, many more
What worries me is that we've created an environment where we've divided every...
There we go. I have Bill Clinton saying the same thing. I have Joe Biden saying the same thing. They all seem to agree about this new world order. And George H.W. Bush gave us a pretty honest description of what it would be. A world in which a credible United Nations would use its peacekeeping role, its military forces, to create a world where the vision of the UN's founders will be imposed. And, we know something about the UN's founders. You had Joe Stalin on one side. You had Alger Hiss, our representative, on the other. We put him in jail for working for Joseph Stalin. Why would we sacrifice the vision of our founders in the United States, who said we're all created equal? This is a self-evident truth. God endowed us with rights, and the government exists to protect these rights. Why would we sacrifice that for the vision of a bunch of communists and subversives and people who wanted to create this UN? And, if we judge something by its fruits, it's very clear that there's something really wrong with the United Nations. George H.W. Bush talked about its peacekeeping role. This peacekeeping role, so-called, I've been working with an organization called Hear Their Cries, which includes former high-level officials in the UN. They estimated that just within the last decade, 60,000 women and children have been raped by these UN troops. This was one of my first things that caused me to wake up and realize I had been brainwashed in school. I watched a documentary about what the UN forces had done in Katanga, and that was eye-opening, right? A provincial leader had declared independence. He didn't want to live under communist tyranny. And the UN sent this global military in there, and they started bombing hospitals and bayoneting children and raping women. What kind of crazy organization does this? Well, a satanic organization. So this new world order that they're trying to build, they're dividing the world up into these regional governments. The European Union is probably the most advanced. They've got now, a European army in the works, a European parliament, a single European currency. So the nations that God has ordained to exist are being swallowed up in these regional governments. And as we'll see going through here, these regional governments are all being merged into the single global system that the Bible tells us is eventually coming. The Bible tells us all this is coming. These people are telling us this is all coming. And when you put two and two together, you realize, wow, the Bible is true. And you can't escape that conclusion because we're watching what the Bible predicted 2,000 years ago come true. So what I want to do today is give you just a little bit of an overview of my research. I've been looking at this stuff for about 10 years since I got out of college. And why do I even talk about this? And one of the mottos that I kind of guide my work by is Ephesians 5:11. Have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but reprove them. Or some Bible translations use the term expose them. And so I think we as Christians have a duty to reprove evil, to expose evil, and that's one of the reasons why I've spent some time focusing on this. And also just because it played a significant role in me understanding that the Bible was true. So we know that God has ordained certain things, right? God ordained marriage, one of the very first things He ordained, right? He brought Adam and Eve together. He ordained the family. He ordained nations. He ordained private property, right? When God said, "Thou shalt not steal," that necessarily implies a right to private property. What can you steal if someone doesn't own something? So God has ordained all these things for our benefit in this world, and for His glory as well. And what we see is that Satan and his minions on this earth are waging constant warfare against all of these institutions. And I think it's becoming more and more evident every day. The war on the family, the war on traditional marriage, the war on nations, right? We see nations now being swallowed up into these globalist systems. And so, the Bible warned us that all this was coming. And I think it's just so fascinating. So we'll talk a little bit about the deep state. We'll ignore kind of the government angle for the most part, but it is a big component of it. But some really interesting things are happening now. You have 74% of Americans in a poll saying they're concerned about the deep state, and they might not define the deep state as a tool of Satan to build a demonic global government. But it's interesting that people are waking up to the fact that, as they describe it here, a group of unelected government and military officials are secretly manipulating and directing national policy. That's absolutely happening. And President Trump actually uses the term deep state pretty frequently, which is why I kind of settled on this term. It's just become more popularized in recent years. Rich Higgins, he was on the National Security Council, Director of Policy and Planning, and he talked about this deep state that has this kind of Hegelian idea of the state as God bestriding the earth. He talks about how Islamists and globalists and socialists are all uniting forces to wage war on America, not just as a nation, but even as a national identity. Right? And we see this, of course, happening all over the world with the erosion of the nation state. We have the bureaucratic deep state. And, I say this to point out that I'm not anti-government, right? God ordained government. God actually told us why He ordained government and pointed out that we ought to obey it and that it has certain valuable functions, and that's why He put it here. One of those purposes is to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. Right? So when people kill, and of course God gets to define evil, right? Not us. When we start defining evil things as good and good things as evil, we're getting into very problematic territory. God gets to define evil, and God has defined murder and robbery and these sorts of sins as evil. And so we have a government that should exist to protect us from those evils, to punish evildoers. Unfortunately, it's moving in a very different direction, as I think a lot of you know, right? Today, the government not only protects the right to kill babies, they subsidize the killing of babies, right? In the United States, in Canada, all over the Western world, big parts of the world. So government has really gone off the rails, and it's all related to what prophecy tells us is coming. Now, this doesn't mean we need unlimited obedience to government, right? The Bible gives us a lot of examples of righteous defiance of wicked and ungodly decrees from government. Daniel, I think, is a really good example. Bow down to that statue. Sorry, but no, right? You can't pray to God anymore. Well, sorry, but I'm going to go to the window and I'm going to pray to God. And that is what God expects us to do when we're confronted with a command from government that is ungodly or against what He has decreed. In other cases, obviously, we need to obey the government. We're told that. And we have a lot of examples of this throughout Scripture, right? The Hebrew midwives who refused to kill the babies. Even the disciples who refused to stop preaching in the name of Jesus when they were commanded to do that. So there is a time and a place for defying ungodly things, and the Bible tells us we ought to obey God rather than men. This is just to give you some perspective on the government in the United States. There's about 3 million bureaucrats working in the federal government, not including the military. That doesn't include the 20 million working at the state and local level. I wonder if God really intended such a giant apparatus to punish evil. But this is their political donations. So you can see they're very, very much anti-Trump. And I think it's interesting. You know, they all are united with this ideology that Hillary Clinton represents, which is globalism, which is government control of all these different areas. She actually told us on the campaign trail, if you have these cultural values from your religious institutions about marriage and gender and these types of things, those are going to have to change, right? They have almost infinite ways to nail people. This is a liberal attorney here, Harvey Silvergate. He says in the book 3 Felonies a Day that the average American commits 3 felonies every day without knowing about it. Right? So if you cross them, they can very easily destroy you. They say they're waging a war on terrorism. Well, here is 72 categories of domestic terrorists that they identified during the Obama administration, and you'll probably be surprised to know that everybody sitting in this room, if you have a pulse and an opinion, would qualify under these definitions, right? You have Christians, Ron Paul supporters, people who oppose the LGBT agenda, people who want to control the border, opponents of a new world order, conspiracy theorists, Christians, Jews, Catholics. This is actually a slide that was used by the U.S. Department of Defense to train our troops. It's about religious extremism. And, we see some of the usual suspects there. You've got Al-Qaeda and Hamas, no problem with that. And then if you look at the very top, we see, I didn't make this slide, by the way. This came straight from the U.S. military's presentation for U.S. soldiers. Evangelical Christians. Yep, and Catholics and Orthodox Jews, right? So they have told us who they're coming for, and it's not who you think, right? God actually told us this was coming, and it is coming, right? This whole apparatus that they're building may not be turned on us tomorrow, but it eventually will. We know that. They'll put us out of the synagogues. The time will come when whoever kills us thinks they're doing God a service. They'll deliver us up to be afflicted, and they'll kill us, and we will be hated by all nations for his name's sake. Right? So let's be fair. God warned us this was coming, right? We shouldn't be surprised as events go in this direction. We should be prepared for these things because we know they're coming. The Bible told us they're coming, and the Bible is always right. So we have these intelligence agencies, and this is not to criticize everybody who works in the intelligence agencies. I know some really great people who work in the CIA and the NSA, but at the top, there are some very wicked things going on. Here's a former senior intelligence community agent from the NSA. He says, now we're going to go nuclear. The intelligence community war is going to new levels. He just got an email from a senior friend in the intelligence community. Trump will die in jail. Here's the Senate Minority Leader, Chuck Schumer, the top Democrat in the Senate, talking about Donald Trump. He says, let me tell you, you take on the intelligence community, they have 6 ways from Sunday to get back at you. So Trump is being really dumb to do this, right? He had questioned some of the things that the intelligence agencies were doing. They have now conscripted or even helped create all of these big technology giants, Facebook, Google, all the rest, into this total surveillance apparatus. They have helped unleash a Christian genocide in the Middle East. And actually, back in 2012, long before ISIS popped on the scene, I did an investigation of this. We did a cover story about it in the New American Magazine. All of these wars that they had launched in the Middle East, they all had one effect in common, and that was that the Christian communities were being slaughtered on a massive scale. And they knew this was coming, right? The invasion of Iraq. George Bush was warned that when that happened, the Christians were going to be slaughtered, and he did it anyway. Right? There was 3 million Christians in Iraq when George W. Bush invaded. Today, there's maybe 100,000, and they live in fear. Many of them have fled. Tragically, a lot of them fled to Syria, where then they were tortured and captured and crucified and beheaded and enslaved by more Islamic extremists. And once again, we see the fingerprints of the deep state in the United States. This is from a memo from the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency. This was put out in 2012. We only pried it loose a few years later. Judicial Watch got it in a lawsuit. They say the West, U.S. government, British government, probably the Canadian government, I don't know, Gulf countries, right, the Sunni Arab dictatorships, Islamic dictatorships, and Turkey support the Syrian opposition. Well, we all knew that. Then they go on to say that the Salafists and the Muslim Brotherhood and Al-Qaeda are the ones driving the insurgency in Syria. So they're telling us they're supporting an insurgency that is led by Al-Qaeda. And they openly admit that they knew it. They say it in their own documents. And then here's the real kicker. There's a possibility of establishing a declared or undeclared Salafist Principality. Salafism is this radical, Islam that wants to kill all the Christians and behead apostates and things. And this is exactly what the supporting powers to the opposition want. So they want a Salafist Principality in eastern Syria. Today we call it the Islamic State, or ISIS, and they have massacred more Christians than we probably will ever know. Right here you can see the Salafist Principality they wanted on the map. So when Trump said that in many respects ISIS is honoring President Obama, he's the founder of ISIS, Hillary Clinton is the co-founder, he wasn't messing around, right? He actually tweeted a few days later that document that I just mentioned to you. We have smoking gun evidence that the Obama administration helped to arm and create the Islamic State that has been massacring Christians. It's not an accident, right? They use false flag operations. This one struck close to home because it's about Miami. They were planning to blow up a civilian airliner. They were planning to plant bombs in my hometown, blame it on a foreign government, and use it as an excuse to start a war. These are the kinds of tactics that are being used, right? And this is clearly satanic, right? God has told us we should not lie, we should not bear false witness. When you're talking about killing people and blaming people who didn't do it, that's demonic, that's evil, right? And there's all kinds of these things. A big part of the justification for building this apparatus was protecting us from radical Islam. We know that's a hoax, right? Before that, it was protecting us from communism, and we know that was a hoax too. Here's the U.S. ambassador to Cuba, Earl Smith. He wrote a whole book about this called The Fourth Floor. He said, we are responsible for bringing Castro to power. He tried to warn them, hey, this guy's a communist, don't do it, and yet they did it anyway, right? Here's the head of the CIA, John Brennan, during the Obama administration. This guy openly admitted that he voted for the Communist Party candidate before getting his security clearance, and then that he told the CIA that he voted for the Communist Party candidate. And so obviously they fired him, right? Oh, you're a security risk, you can't work in the CIA. Well, no, right? They promoted him up through the ranks until he ended up at the head of it. And there's so many of these guys, right? Leon Panetta used to run the Institute for Policy Studies, basically a Soviet front group in the United States, ended up the head of the CIA and the head of the Defense Department. So clearly, these institutions, this apparatus to defend us from communism and terrorism, is not really aimed at defending us from communism and terrorism, right? Christians eventually will be the target. They're murdering people in huge numbers, and murder is the only appropriate term here. None of these people have been even charged with a crime, much less offered a trial and the opportunity to confront their accusers and present evidence, given an opportunity to talk to a jury. They're just dropping bombs out of the sky and killing people just because somebody in the intelligence community says that that's a suspected militant, right? Here's two of their victims. These are both American children who were blown to bits by these bombs dropped from Obama's drones, and it's continuing under Trump, I regret to inform you. Actually, I had a video that I was going to show, but due to time constraints, I'll just tell you about it. The head of the CIA and the head of the NSA bragging in a conference, we kill people based on metadata, right? One of our senators had to stand on the floor of the Senate for 12 hours to get the Attorney General to say, no, we won't bomb people without charging them with a crime in the United States. Right? They were talking about flying drones around the United States and bombing people. That's where this is all heading, right? It might not come tomorrow, might not even come 10 years from now, but that's where we're heading. And trust me, they're not looking for Islamic extremists, right? Maybe right now they think they are, but this is one of the whistleblowers from the NSA, William Binney. He actually resigned in 2001 because he said, hey, they're spying on everybody's phone calls. They're collecting all your phone calls. They're collecting all your emails. All of this is going into these big databases. At some point, artificial intelligence and advanced computing will be able to analyze all that. They will have a more complete picture of your life than you have. Right? They'll know everything about you, what you did at 9:02 p.m. on Saturday, April 2nd, right? They'll know it all. They spy on Congress, right? This is actually a very deep state friendly senator, and she found out that the CIA had broken into her committee's computers when they were investigating the CIA's torture, and they had erased a bunch of the evidence, deleted documents, changed documents. And so if Congress is not safe, we now know they were spying on Trump. We know they've been spying on federal judges. We know they've been using blackmail against them. This is the reality that we're heading into, right? They've been caught running guns to Mexican drug cartels. They've been caught running guns to Islamic terrorists. They actually got caught running guns to Mexican drug cartels, and they said, oh, we were investigating the guy. And then it turns out the guy was already on the FBI payroll, right? What they were doing was sending guns there and then saying, oh, look, bad Americans and your gun rights, that's why Mexicans are killing each other. The reality is that they were ordered to do that by the federal government. The CIA helped create the European Union, and we have smoking gun proof of this too. I co-wrote a book about it with a globalist, actually, who just, he's still a globalist, but he realized that the main crop of globalists pushing this are all insane. But lots of documents on this. And this will give you a little bit of sense about the European Union. That's the European Parliament right there. That's the Tower of Babel. That's an official European Union poster right there in the middle, with the stars around it. Europe, many tongues, one voice, right? So they're doing something, right? We found out they were doing mind control experiments. This is back in the 1950s. They shredded most of the documents, but we still got some. They were force-feeding LSD to mental patients. Some of this was going on in Canada as well. And you know, the types of things that they have figured out how to do would blow us away. As several people said yesterday, we don't know the half of it, right? What we know is pretty intense, but we don't know the half of it. The CIA had an Operation Mockingbird in the 1950s. They recruited 400 journalists to tell lies to the American people. You know, when you're solving a crime, you always want to look at where does the money come from, right? Follow the money, as they say. And we know where a lot of this money is coming from. This gentleman here, Carroll Quigley, who was Bill Clinton's mentor, one of the few people Bill Clinton thanked when he became president, wrote a fantastic book. Big parts of it are rather boring, but some of the explosive revelations in there are worth reading. And he said he was allowed to examine the papers of what we would today call the deep state for several years, and he agreed with most of their aims. What he disagreed with was the secrecy. And here's just a couple of things that he said, and we could go on with this forever. The powers of financial capitalism had a far-reaching aim, a system of world control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. The system was going to be controlled in a feudalist fashion by the central banks acting in concert at secret meetings, and the apex of the system would be the Bank for International Settlements in Switzerland. The great majority of the world has never even heard of the Bank for International Settlements. The Rothschild Dynasty, you know, one of the big banking dynasties, is very, very heavily involved in all of this. They brag on their website. I pulled this right from one of their bank's websites. They've been at the center of the world's financial markets for more than 200 years, and they can rely on an unrivaled global network. And that's no exaggeration. It's true. They say they could be closer to current issues than any other financial institution. And it's true, right? They can be. This guy who's an apologist for the Rothschilds, Niall Ferguson, a globalist, a member of a lot of these deep state organizations, he wrote that they had decided the outcome of the Napoleonic Wars by putting their financial weight behind Britain. So what kind of dynasty has the power to decide the outcome of a war between two of the most powerful governments that had ever existed in human history? Obviously, that's some real power, right? They never went anywhere. Here's Baron Eric de Rothschild. I came across him when I was researching the head of UNESCO, an actual communist. He wanted to make her the head of the United Nations. And he signed an open letter saying this woman, Irina Bokova, an actual communist from the Bulgarian Communist Party, slaughtered hundreds of thousands of people in Bulgaria, should become the head of the United Nations. And that's par for the course for the United Nations, right? They control most of the major corporations of the world through interlocking boards, interlocking ownership structures. There was a very good study that came out of Switzerland about that. In the journal PLOS1 was published in 2011. And they've been financing communism all along. And I mentioned earlier the intelligence agencies have been deeply involved in promoting communism and protecting communism. This is one of America's finest historians, Anthony Sutton. He's gone now. But he was at Stanford University, and he wrote this incredible book. If you haven't read it, I encourage you to. It's called Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution. And what he shows is that what we today call the deep state, Wall Street financiers and other powerful individuals in the United States, financed the Russian Revolution. And it is indisputable. It's proven beyond a reasonable doubt. They steal your money using the printing press, right? Maybe a subject for another day. I could talk for a week on the Federal Reserve System. And then they take all this money that they loot from us and they put it in these tax-exempt foundations. And part of it they use for yachts and private jets, you know, owned in the name of the foundation. And part of it they use to subvert our society. The U.S. Senate identified them recently in a 2014 report. They called it the Billionaires Club that had created the Green Movement, right? The global warming and the environmentalism as a pretext for a global government. Bill Gates funded national standards in the United States through Common Core. George Soros funds, you know, every kind of subversive movement you can think of, riots in the streets and so on. And Congress actually investigated these foundations. Let me show you this video quickly.
I said, yes, Mr. Gator, I'd like very much to know. Whereupon he made this statement to me, namely, Mr. Dodd, we here operate on in response to similar directives, the substance of which is that we shall use our grant-making power so to alter life in the United States that it can be comfortably merged with the Soviet Union.
This was the chief investigator for the Congressional Committee investigating these foundations. He said the head of the Ford Foundation told him what they were doing was so altering life in the United States that it could be comfortably merged with the Soviet Union. And they're not messing around, right? They said that these foundations were promoting internationalism. We call it globalism today, moral relativism. They said that they're directly supporting subversion in the true sense of the term. They've financed attacks on our social and governmental systems. They've used education to bring about oligarchical oligarchical collectivism, and they said that a revolution in the past tense had already occurred that never would have been possible had they not hijacked control of the education system. So this was in the 1950s. They said the revolution was in the past, and it never would have been possible had they not used these foundations to finance the subversion of our educational system. We cover some of this in Crimes of the Educators. I think education really has been one of the key tools to bring all this about. Well, public education. If you were here last night, you heard some of my talk on that. But I think there's copies of the book in the back if you're interested in learning why half of Americans are basically functionally illiterate and why we're moving down this path. And so now for the last 20 minutes that I have here, I'd like to talk about the deep state behind the deep state, which I think is even more interesting than the government agencies and the intelligence agencies and so on. There's this huge constellation of these secret and semi-secret organizations, and we won't have time to hit all of them. I'll just hit a few of the ones that I think are most important. But before you say, hey, you're being a conspiracy theorist, I want to point you to Mr. Rockefeller, the late Mr. Rockefeller. He died a couple of years ago, and he wrote in his autobiography, this was in 2004, on page 405, you can get this book at your library, it says, some even believe that we, the Rockefeller family, are part of a secret cabal, remember these words, a secret cabal working against the best interests of the United States, characterizing my family and me as internationalists and of conspiring, so it's his word, not mine, they're conspiring with others around the world to build a more integrated global political and economic structure. One world, if you will. And then he says that if that's the charge, I am guilty and I'm proud of it. So according to one of the chief conspirators, he is conspiring against the best interests of his own country to build a one-world government, right? And we know who ultimately is going to be running this one-world government when it arrives, right? Carroll Quigley, back to him, he said that the argument that the two parties should represent opposed ideals, one of the left and one of the right, is foolish, right? The two parties should be almost identical so that we can throw the rascals out at any election and things will continue, right? And so this is their strategy, right? They do talk different, the left and the right, but ultimately at the establishment level, at the deep state level, they're all moving us in the same direction. One of the key institutions pushing this, not just in the United States, but also in Canada, is the Council on Foreign Relations. We know a lot about the genesis of this organization from Carroll Quigley, who I mentioned earlier. He pointed out that Cecil Rhodes, when he passed away, left this huge amount of money to create what was called the Round Table groups. And these were all over the world, primarily in Britain and then in the United States. And the chief outpost of these Round Table groups in the United States is the Council on Foreign Relations. Their goal, of course, being a global government. Their occult logo says everywhere, right? It's founded in 1921 after the U.S. Senate overwhelmingly rejected participation in the League of Nations, which was intended to be the kind of proto-global government from which they would build a proper global government. They said, oh my goodness, those crazy Americans, they're never going to go for our globalism. We need to do something. So they created this organization. They recruited the most powerful people in the different parties, in the finance, in the media, and they have less than 5,000 members. But if you read the list of who's involved, you'll see that it's people like this.
Thank you very much, Richard, and I am delighted to be here in these new headquarters. I have been often to, the mothership in New York City, but it's good to have an outpost of the council right here down the street from the State Department. We get a lot of advice from the council, so this will mean I won't have as far to go to be told what we should be doing and how we should think about the future.
So that was when she was Secretary of State, and she's admitting in public that the Council on Foreign Relations tells her what she should be doing and how she should be thinking about the world. So here we thought it was the American people, right? Here's Darth Vader.
It's good to be back at the Council on Foreign Relations. As Pete mentioned, I've been a member for a long time and was actually a director for some period of time. I never mentioned that when I was campaigning for re-election back home in Wyoming.
That's so funny, right? For those of you who don't follow American politics closely, that was the Republican vice president for George W. Bush. So Republican, Democrat, they're all part of the club, and we're not in it, right? And here you get some sense of the numbers. The Council on Foreign Relations dominates the presidential administrations, regardless of what party is officially in power. Almost the entire cabinet for these administrations comes from the CFR. I mean, that's where they get their people from. And not just the cabinet members, but then the deputy secretaries, the assistant secretaries, the deputy assistant secretaries. They have multiple members on the Supreme Court, all up and down the levers of power. If you looked at the list of members, even Fox News, a lot of people think Fox News is your conservative alternative, or Wall Street Journal. News Corporation, which owns those two, is actually a corporate member of the Council on Foreign Relations. And Rupert Murdoch, the boss of these organizations, is also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. So you're given a choice in rhetoric, but ultimately it all leads to the same place. This was really interesting, just because this guy spent 16 years in the Council on Foreign Relations. He was an admiral in our Navy. And when he left, 16 years later, he said, "Oh my goodness, what is going on here? I'm not going to be part of this." He said, the main purpose of the Council on Foreign Relations, and he wrote this in a book with Phyllis Schlafly, the main purpose of the Council on Foreign Relations is promoting the disarmament of U.S. sovereignty and national independence and the submergence into an all-powerful one-world government. This lust to surrender the sovereignty and independence of the United States is pervasive throughout most of the membership. And he says, in the entire CFR lexicon, there is no term of revulsion carrying a meaning so deep as America first. Right? And so now you know why the media, owned by members of the Council on Foreign Relations, hates Donald Trump so much. And I'm not, a Donald Trump apologist. I'm not telling you you need to like him or anything. But his slogan for his campaign, if you don't follow American politics, was America first. And we know that's the term that the CFR hates more than any other term, right? They brag in their magazine that they're building a world government. Here's the former Assistant Secretary of State wrote in the Council on Foreign Relations magazine that the House of World Order will have to be built from the bottom up rather than the top down. An end run around national sovereignty, eroding it piece by piece, will accomplish much more than the old-fashioned assault. And so that's their modus operandi, right? They do it quietly, they do it secretly. UN treaty here, North American agreement there, international bureaucracy here. Pretty soon you wake up and you no longer control your own country, right? And that's the plan. They're doing it all over the world. They did it in Europe. They're building an African Union. Putin is building a Eurasian Union. In Southeast Asia, they're building the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. In South America, they're building the Union of South American States. And everywhere you look, suddenly, out of the blue, all the people of the world just decided, hey, we don't need our countries anymore. Let's just have regional governments, right? If you believe that, again, I told you guys yesterday, I have this really nice beachfront property in Nebraska. Come see me after the talk. The Trilateral Commission, this was actually founded by the self-described conspirator with his secret cabal, David Rockefeller. He got together with Zbigniew Brzezinski. He read a book that Zbigniew Brzezinski had written about America's role in the technotronic age. And essentially the book says America is obsolete, individual liberty is obsolete, Marxism is the way of the future. The Soviet Union's got some problems, but really Marxism is awesome, and we need to build a global government where we merge these together. And David Rockefeller liked it so much that he said, hey, I want you to run my new organization, the Trilateral Commission. And it's kind of like a more elite version of the Council on Foreign Relations, but it also brings in a lot of Canadians, a lot of Japanese, and a lot of Western Europeans. Right? And the goal, of course, is the same. Barry Goldwater, Republican candidate for President of the United States, I think this is so interesting what he said, that their goal is to consolidate the four centers of power: political, monetary, intellectual, and ecclesiastical. Right? So they are building a one-world religion, and maybe that's a talk for another day. Highly relevant, right? Here's some of the other groups. I chose this picture here. Some of you might recognize it. They hold a World Government Summit now in Arabia every year, and all the heads of the UN and the IMF and the World Bank and even members of the U.S. Cabinet and Canadian leaders and the heads of the big technology companies, they come together. And in 2017 at the World Government Summit, they erected this Arch of Baal. Right, and I'm sure some of you remember Baal from reading your Bible, right? Likes child sacrifices and things like that. God certainly does not approve. And so, of course, the globalists raise an Arch of Baal at their World Government Summit. Bilderberg Group is another one of these secretive organizations, about 150 of the most powerful people in the world, and they're useful idiots, right? Not everybody who goes to these is a secret conspirator. Sometimes they're just kind of feeling them out. Do you agree with us? Will you work with us? Until recently, it was virtually unknown, right? Even a lot of the media said, oh, you're a conspiracy theorist if you even talk about it, because it's not even a real thing. Well, it's a real thing. It has a website. I've been to 2 of their meetings, obviously not as an invited guest, right? They don't like people like me, which is just fine. I wear it as a badge of honor. But they've given a lot of insight into what they're up to. Right before becoming president, Obama went. Right before becoming president, Bill Clinton, this no-name governor from Arkansas that nobody had ever heard of, went to Bilderberg, and then boom, he's our new president. Congratulations. Tony Blair, an unknown member of parliament in the UK, who knows about him, goes to Bilderberg, boom, you're our new prime minister, right? And then he goes around blabbering about the New World Order. Mario Monti, all these guys, right? According to the BBC, all the recent presidents of the European Commission went to Bilderberg before they became president. So here's some of the attendees, more of them. Bill Clinton, David Cameron, Michael Hayden, the guy who likes to kill people based on their metadata, on and on, right? Jeff Bezos, the guy who owns Amazon, supposedly the richest man in the world. Here, this guy, Will Hutton, editor of a newspaper, he said that the Bilderberg is one of the key meetings of the year. The consensus established is the backdrop against which policy is made worldwide. Right? And see here, most people don't even know about Bilderberg, but here they are admitting that policy worldwide is made at their little meetings. Here is the former head of NATO. The participants are obviously supposed to use this report that comes out of Bilderberg in the areas in which they affect, right, in setting policy. This is one of the Bilderberg meetings I went to in Copenhagen. Obviously, I didn't go inside, but this guy was the head of the Dutch Labour Party, and he came outside. He wanted to talk. I think he was a noob. He hadn't been there before, and I think he thought it was really cool that everybody thought he was so powerful. So he came out and talked to the protesters and the journalists, and we said to him, hey, are you here in a formal capacity? And he said, well, yes, I'm formal because being a politician, you're 24/7. So there's no way of exiting my role. But their cover story is always, oh, these are just private discussions. We're not there in a formal capacity. We're not setting policy. But then they come out and they tell us what they're doing. Here, the former chancellor of the former British chancellor of the Exchequer, Dennis Healey, he said in public in an interview with the UK Guardian, a very far-left anti-Christian newspaper, those of us, basically, we're building a world government. It's a little bit exaggerated to say we want a world government, but it's not wholly unfair. Those of us in Bilderberg felt we couldn't go on forever fighting one another for nothing and killing people and rendering millions homeless. So we felt that a single community throughout the world would be a good thing. And so, they always couch this in terms, it's for your own good, right? We're taking your freedom for your own good. We're building a satanic world government for your own good. And some of them might actually believe this. There's plenty of useful idiots who get sucked into these things. Oh, I want peace, and, getting rid of the nations that God has ordained will be a good way to do that. Here, one of the guys on the steering committee of the Bilderberg admitted that they helped create the euro. And last but certainly not least, I want to talk to you guys a little bit about some of the secret societies, and there's a lot more that we could go through, but I just choose these because I think they're especially relevant. Skull and Bones is one of the big ones. Anybody ever heard of Skull and Bones? Oh, wow. So you guys are amazing because most people never heard of Skull and Bones. This is their actual logo, right? Nice people, I'm sure. It made me think of Proverbs 8:36. All they that hate me love death, right? So people who hate God love death. We know that. So here's George W. Bush talking about it.
You were both in Skull and Bones, the secret society.
It's so secret we can't talk about it.
What does that mean for America? The conspiracy theorists are going to go
I'm
on.
sure they are. I don't know. I haven't seen the web.
Number 322?
First of all, he's not the nominee. And, look, I look forward...
Are you prepared to lose?
No, I'm not going to lose.
You both were members of Skull and Bones, a secret society at Yale. What does that tell us?
Not much, because it's a secret.
Is there a secret handshake? Is there a secret code?
I wish there were something secret I could manifest.
322, secret number?
There are all kinds of secrets, Tim, but one thing is not a secret. I disagree with this president's direction that he's taking the...
Anyways, it's interesting that in 2004 we had option between Skull and Bone Candidate A and Skull and Bone Candidate B, and none of them can talk about it. Some people have kind of climbed up on the walls and recorded in there, and they're doing all these weird death rituals and laying in coffins and doing things that you can't speak of in public, shameful things, screaming and acting like weirdos, right? And as a secular person, what do you do with that, right? I mean, if you don't believe the Bible, how do you explain this stuff? I don't know. And so when I was younger, I saw all this, I'm like, my goodness, the Bible must be correct. And so that's one of the reasons why I looked into this stuff and why I talk about this stuff. This guy was the founder of Skull and Bones, an actual drug dealer. So it's a family drug business. A lot of intelligent people speculate that the Skull and Bones may be kind of an outgrowth of the Illuminati. We'll talk about them in a little bit. But a lot of bizarre rituals. Here's some of the members, right? William Buckley, supposedly Mr. Conservative, right, founded the National Review, and he was the one who was allowed to police the boundaries of the conservative movement. And anybody he didn't like was expelled from the conservative movement, right? Well, he was a member of Skull and Bones. So were a lot of other people on the left and the right. And their strategy was actually not that complicated. Anthony Sutton, again, one of America's finest historians from Stanford University, I mentioned him earlier. He at first did not think that this was a big deal, Skull and Bones. But a friend of mine, Charlotte Iserbit, who was a senior advisor on education to Ronald Reagan, her father and her grandfather were both members. And so when they passed away, she said, hey, Anthony Sutton, you need to see all these documents. She passed them on to him, and he said, oh my goodness, what in the world? This is huge. And he wrote this book, America's Secret Establishment, an Introduction to the Skull and Bones. He says basically this secret society is a recruiting ground for a conspiracy to create a global government. And this was so insightful. In this dialectical process, change requires conflict, and conflict requires the clash of opposites. You can't just have a right, you must have a right and a left. And so you get a George W. Bush on the right and a John Kerry on the left, and they argue within the Overton window. Anything outside of that is extreme, is radical, is kooky, is racist, is pick your term. And we see this also with William Buckley, right? The supposed leader of the conservative movement is a member of Skull and Bones, and the leaders of the liberals are members of Skull and Bones, right? So it's very, very crafty, their manipulation. Another secret society that I want to talk about is the Bohemian Grove. Not too far from you guys, actually. If you just drive straight south from here, you'll find them. They have these 2,000 acres. 2,500 of the most powerful men in the world get together in the redwood forests of Northern California at this weird retreat covered with owls. This is an actual picture of their 40-foot stone owl. Super weird, right? What do you do with this as a secular person? How do you explain this stuff? And this was founded after the Civil War. Total secrecy, right? Every Republican president since Donald Trump has been an attendee at this Bohemian Grove. Members of the cabinet, CEOs of all the big oil companies, and anyone you can think of that's somebody important who's a man has probably been here, except maybe Trump. And this is a video. I don't know if you guys know Alex Jones, a talk radio host in the U.S. He snuck in some years ago with a video camera and recorded one of their little rituals. It's called the cremation of care. I want to show you just a little bit of it.
After about 10 more minutes of music, suddenly all around the owl, activity began. Here is the main central part of the ritual.
That's totally normal, right? That's what normal people do on the weekends. Wearing hoods, carrying torches, chanting about forest spirits. So anyways, it goes on for a long time. You can find it on YouTube. They burn what they claim is a human effigy at the feet of this owl. A horrifying scream. Apparently they say it was like a recording of a scream. Whatever they're doing, it's super weird, right? It's super weird. And, if you're not a Christian, I don't know how you explain these things, right? God told us that this is the type of thing we would see in the world, especially as we get closer to the end times, right? The Bible calls Satan the prince of this world, even the god of this world. And so we should expect that his minions would be into some pretty weird stuff. And, of course, they are, right? Here you see Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon sitting at the Bohemian Grove thingamajig. Here, Richard Nixon wrote in his autobiography that if he had to choose one speech that gave him the most pleasure, it would be the one he gave at the Bohemian Grove. Traditionally, it was off the record, no publicity, right? And he said it was the first milestone on his road to the presidency. And see, here we go away thinking, oh, we choose who's going to be the president, right? All right. Anyways, this might be interesting to you guys in Canada. They hacked into the emails of this Colin Powell. He was our Secretary of State for a time. He was writing to one of your former officials, the Canadian Minister of Justice, Attorney General Peter Gordon McKay. And he says to his friend in Canada, I'm back from the Bohemian Grove. Surprise, surprise, I sat next to Stephen Harper a couple of times. Had a nice discussion. Grove attendees know that Trump is a disaster. And for me, that's about as good an endorsement as you can get, right?
And now they're faced with a very real prospect of Donald Trump becoming the leader of the party, and it absolutely drives them crazy. They just cannot imagine sharing. Well, because he's an outsider. He's not them. He's not part of the club. He's uncontrollable. He hasn't been through the initiation rites. He didn't belong to the secret society. And I think that they don't see him. They have no idea how to relate to him.
Yep. This just came out recently from WikiLeaks. How many of you have heard of John Podesta? He was the chief of staff to Bill Clinton. He was the chairman of Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign. His emails got hacked, and turns out he went to a spirit cooking. And see, normal people have never heard of a spirit cooking because it's so weird, right? They hide in the shadows. Evil loves darkness, right? So he went to the spirit cooking. This was the lady who did it, this woman here holding a goat head. Spirit cooking. Some of it you can't really describe because it's so horrifying, but right, thank you. Right? But they mix blood and semen and all kinds of things together, and then they paint on the walls, summoning these spirits, right, demons, of course. And this ritual was developed by a guy, Aleister Crowley. He was called the most wicked man in the world. He called himself the Beast 666, pedophile, drug fiend, absolute lunatic, said, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law, right? That's the kind of philosophy these people have. And so Hillary Clinton's campaign manager goes to spirit cookings. Who would have guessed? So the Order of the Illuminati is a historical organization. The term now, a lot of people hear Illuminati and they think, oh, here we go, tinfoil hat stuff. It was a real organization founded in 1776 by Adam Weishaupt. It became very influential. It infiltrated Masonic lodges all across Europe. Its goal was to destroy all the religions and governments of Europe, to undermine the family, to get rid of private property, and to create a world government controlled by themselves. They got discovered and banned. A lot of the German princes came after them. And the whole thing was widely exposed in this book. I highly recommend it if you haven't read it. Published in 1797, called Proofs of a Conspiracy Against All the Governments and Religions of Europe. It was written by John Robison, the first chief of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. He argued that the Illuminati, by infiltrating the Masonic lodges of Europe, brought about the French Revolution. If you guys remember the French Revolution, it was basically a revolution against Christianity, right? Christians were losing their heads right and left. They hated God so much that they couldn't even stand the 7-day week. So we'll have to have a 10-day week because God created the world in 7 days. Can't have that. That's silly Christian fables, and so we'll get rid of that. And if you notice, the principles we'll get to this in a minute. George Washington actually read the book I just mentioned to you, and he wrote in a letter to his pastor friend who gave it to him, "It's not my intention to doubt that the doctrine of the Illuminati and the principles of Jacobinism had not spread in the United States. On the contrary, no one is more satisfied of this fact than I am." Right? So his friend, who was a pastor, gave him that book, and he read it, and he said, yep, the Illuminati is here. And if you notice, the principles that these people were pursuing, get rid of Christianity, front and center, right? Get rid of the family, get rid of marriage, get rid of private property, build a world government. These are all the same principles that Karl Marx and his little buddies came up with, right? If you actually read Richard Wurmbrand, I'm sure a lot of you guys know him, imprisoned in communist Romania for Christ, was brutally tortured. He wrote a fantastic book. If you haven't read it, I can't recommend it highly enough. Marx and Satan. See, we're taught that Marx was an atheist who said religion is the opiate of the masses. In reality, I think Marx was actually a Satanist. I think he hated God, and this book makes that case very well. If you read his poetry, you'll see that he did not believe in God. He hated God. And we know people who hate God love death. Right? So what do we do about all this? Well, the first thing we need to do is pray. Right? Pray that God would give us wisdom, that he would guide us, that he would protect us, that we could understand what our role should be, what we should be doing. Obviously time is short. We need to be telling people the gospel, and we need to be explaining to people what's coming so that as they see it coming, they recognize, that the Bible predicted it. I guess the Bible is true. That means I need Jesus Christ to be saved, right? We need to read our Bibles, right? If we don't understand our Bibles, we won't understand what's happening in the world. We need to educate our children and protect them. If you want to help make people aware of the deep state, we put together this special report in the New American Magazine, basically a much more extended version of what I just presented to you today. And again, I can't emphasize strongly enough protecting our children, right? We don't want to give our children to these people to educate, right? They don't have any interest in educating them. They have every interest in corrupting them and destroying them and taking their souls to hell. And we need to realize, too, that this is not a political battle, right? It's just voting for some guy is not actually going to fix this. God told us what we're dealing with in Ephesians 6:12. He says, "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places." And he tells us what to do about it. Our weapons are not, guns and votes. Right? Our weapons are taking the shield of faith, wherewith ye shall be able to quench all the fiery darts of the wicked. Take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the Word of God. So what is our offensive weapon here? The Word of God, right? The Bible, right? That is how we deal with this. And then, not to sound too much like a downer, I want to conclude with some hopeful passages. Psalms 2:2 tells us that the kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers conspire together against the Lord and his anointed one. So that's what we just saw, right? These little kings, they're conspiring against God and against his people. And then here's what God does. The one enthroned in heaven laughs, right? The Lord ridicules them. So if the Lord ridicules them, we can laugh too, right? There's nothing to be scared of. We don't need to tell a majority of people. We don't need a majority of people on our side. Somebody said yesterday, I thought it was so great, if God be for us, who can be against us, right? That's what the Bible tells us. With God, we are a majority, right? And think about how God used Gideon and 300 men, right? We don't need a majority. All we need to do is do what God says. And the really good news, in the end, we win, they lose. Praise God. Thank you guys so much. God bless you. I've got to run, but thank you guys so much.